Okay, welcome everybody to the delayed Gemarah share, and we've got quite a good turnout for a Thursday, really. Let's go where we were up to last week. There we go. I'll just share the screen with you straight away. It's on page 58 for those of you who are following in the hard copy Steinsaltz. We're on page 11b for those who are in an art scroll or a big boys Gemarah. And what we did, what we were talking about last week was that there were three things. Let's just go from this little symbol here. Tanu Rabbanan, this is what we did last week. We're talking about intercalating the year. There were three main reasons. Al Ha'aviv, when the grain, this is the barley grain, is not ripe in the month of Pesach, because of course we have to bring the Korban Omer, and we spoke about that. We spoke last week in some detail about the differences between the Sadukim, the Sadducees, and the Pharisees, the Perushim. By the way, I got a bit of flack from that because I told everyone on the shiur that I would probably be at Saduki if I was there. I got a bit of flack from that in a few private emails. But I'm not saying that I don't believe in Torah Shabbat al Peh, but on this particular point, I'm very, very strongly persuaded by the Sadducee argument. So let's just make that clear. I do believe in the Torah Shabbat al Peh. I'm not a complete heretic, although some would say I am. Okay, so that was number one, was the grain in Pesach time, al peirot ha'ilan. The other reason, the second reason, was if the fruits were not ripe enough at Shavuot time, because that's when you have to bring the first fruits, the bikurim. And if they're not ripe, then you can't do it on Shavuot, and you're meant to do it on Shavuot if you can. And the third one was Hatkufah, the equinox, and it has to be that the seasons, well, the Chagim had to be in their correct seasons. And what we said was Al Shnayim Mehen Ma'abrin. If two of these three factors were present, we would intercalate, or the Nasi would intercalate. But on one of them, ein ma'abrin, wasn't good enough. One of them alone is not good enough. But that isn't entirely the whole picture, because what we're going to see now is that actually there is an opinion, and we just mentioned this right at the end of last week's shiur. There is an opinion, according to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, there's an opinion about what he said, that one of them is sufficient, as long as that one of them is the Tekufah. In other words, that the seasons be in the right place, or Pesach be in the right season, basically. So the Gemarah says like this, Ubizman she'aviv echad mehen. And at the time, if it will be that one of the two reasons for intercalating will be that the grain is not yet ripe, hakol smechin, everybody is happy. Why are they happy? Because they don't mind waiting for an extra month till the grain is ripe. It's really not so much that they're happy if they have to wait. It's the converse which is true here. And that is that if this is not one of the reasons, if the grain is already ripe, the barley grain is already ripe, and they intercalate and make you wait another month in the year, then there's a whole other month where you can't use your new grain. Because remember, we spoke about this a week or two ago, that you can't use the new grain until you've brought the Omer offering, which is on the second day of Pesach. So if you intercalate the year and you make Pesach a month later, and your grain is already ripe, then your grain is sat there for a month doing nothing. You can't use it. And obviously some of it will get dried out. Some of it will not be as fresh as it should be. So people were not happy when the year was intercalated for a reason other than the grain not being ripe at Pesach time. So the way the Breiter puts it is that everybody's happy if one of the reasons for intercalation is that the grain wasn't ripe, because then when Pesach comes along, the grain will be ripe. They'll do the Omer, and they can use their new grain straight away. They can grind it up, make their bread, etc., etc. And then, and this is what we finished with last time, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says something very cryptic, and he says, Alat Kufa, 2 words, Alat Kufa, on the Tekufa, on the equinox. And nobody really knew what he meant, because he didn't make it very clear exactly what he was saying. So there were 2 different versions of what he meant when he said that the Tekufa, the equinox, the seasons were a reason. So Ibayalahu. And if you want to say that Alat Kufa, Smechin, what he meant to say when he said Alat Kufa was referring to the line above. So the Gemara says everybody was happy when one of the reasons was the grain was not yet ripe. So one opinion is that when Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel said Alat Kufa, he was referring to people being happy. So in other words, what he was saying was people were happy when this was the reason. The Kufa, the fact that the spring had not yet come, and it was Pesach, so we had to intercalate to make spring a little later. So that was one suggestion. Or maybe that's not what he meant when he said these 2 cryptic words. What he meant was Alat Kufa Ma'abrin, that we do intercalate even if there's only one reason, as long as that one reason is that Kufa, is the fact that Pesach is not in the spring if we don't do it. Now, it seems to me, from my fairly limited knowledge, that that opinion is quite widely held, because if you were to go and ask most people in the outside of this Gemara, so in other words, you would go into a yeshiva where they're not learning Sanhedrin, and you'll say to them, why do we have an intercalation of the year? Why do we have Adar Sheni? Why do we have an extra month sometimes? I think that the vast majority of them will say, so that Pesach is in the spring. And I think that this opinion of what Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel meant has got significant traction. And I think the reason it's got traction is that we have a scriptural source for that, don't we? We're told, and we've been through this pasuk before, we're told in the Torah itself that b'chodesh ha'aviv, in the month of the spring, that is when we do Pesach. So I think that for a number of reasons, the opinion that says we do intercalate the year for one reason, as long as that one reason is the season's reason, despite the fact that a few lines up we've said on one of them we don't intercalate. We need 2, and I think that that's what Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel was arguing with. The other opinion I think fits in as well, because really the truth is that this informs the others, doesn't it? Because if spring has not yet come, then there's a decent chance that the grain is not yet ripe. And there's a decent chance that the fruits will not be ripe 7 weeks later at Shavuot. So in some ways, the two opinions of Rabban Shimon Gamliel of what he meant when he said this are pretty interrelated. And I think, as I say, that's got some traction. What's interesting, though, is the Gemara then has one word, 4 letters, teku. Teku. You see that over there? Teku. Now, the Steinsaltz translates that as the dilemma shall stand unresolved. It's a interesting word, this teku. It is used in modern Hebrew. Does anybody know where it is used most commonly in modern Hebrew? Teku? Anyone? I would expect you to know this, Johnny Halpern. Anyone? David, do you know where it's used in modern Hebrew? I'd expect you to know it as well. Because a teku in football is a draw. In modern Hebrew, if you say, you know, what was the score? And they say teku, it was a draw. Teku means a draw. And that's exactly what this means here. We don't know which of these two opinions is correct. So it's a draw. So the word teku in modern Hebrew means a draw in sporting terms. Now, let's just have a look over here to the left-hand side, over here where I've got my pointer, because it brings us something very interesting here about this word teku. And as Rav Steinsaltz says, various explanations have been offered with regarding to the etymology of this term. One explanation is the word is an abbreviated form of the word tikom, from kam, to stand up. And it means let it stand. We don't know. So it just stands there because we don't know the answer. And another explanation is it comes from the word tik. Everybody knows what a tik is, yeah? A bag. Tik is a handbag or something like that. It also means a pouch or a file. And as it says here, just as upon seeing a case or a pouch, one is unsure of its contents, so too the word teku is used in a situation where a resolution is unknown to us, as if the solution were hidden in a case. And then there's the famous explanation, which is not really an explanation at all. It's just a bit of cute, what's the word, mnemonics. Teku, I was always taught when I first learned Gemara at the age of 10, that teku stood for Tishbi, Yitaretz, Kushiot, V'ba'ayot. Tishbi, who was Tishbi? Who is the Tishbi?
Eliyahu Hanavi.
Eliyahu Hanavi. We sing it on Motzei Shabbat, don't we? Eliyahu Hanavi. Eliyahu HaTishbi. Why was he called HaTishbi? Because that's where he came from. Tishbi is an area of Eretz Israel, and that's where he came from. So Tishbi, if you refer to Tishbi, that means Eliyahu Hanavi. Yitaretz. Now that word comes from the root of that word is teretz. Teretz. Reish tzadi. What does that mean in modern Hebrew?
The answer, teretz. No?
Teretz is an answer. Yeah, that's right. And it also means an excuse, by the way.
Oh.
You know, if you're blamed for something, then you can give a teretz. You can give an excuse for it. But yes, it means an answer. So Tishbi Yitaretz, the Tishbi, i.e. Eliyahu Hanavi, will give the Yitaretz, it's the future tense of the verb, will give the answer to what? Kushiot. Kushiot comes from the word
kashas.
Kashas, yeah, in Yiddish, kashas. We all know about kashas, don't we? The 4 kashas, we all said the 4 kashas when we were little on Seder night. Yeah, the 4 questions. Kashas are questions. Comes from the word, by the way, kasher. In modern Hebrew, what does kasher mean? Hard or difficult.
Difficult.
Yeah. So a question is something that's difficult. So a difficulty. So far.
My father, Oliver Shalom, used to say after the 4 questions that the teretz is avodim hayinu.
That's right, correct. The 4 kashas on Seder night, the 4 questions, and the teretz is, the answer is avodim hayinu, correct. We all did it in Yiddish when we were little. I'm sure you did it in Yiddish, Johnny. Can you still remember it in Yiddish?
Yeah.
Go on then.
At the beginning, Tata, ich will de fragen de 4 kashas.
There you go, that's good enough. Tata, Daddy, ich will de fragen, I wish to ask the 4 kashas, the 4 questions. Yeah, I remember that. I must have learned that when I was.
We had the same teacher, by the way.
Probably, yeah. I must have learned that when I was about 3. It's interesting because I can still remember the whole of the Manish Tana in Yiddish. And I have to struggle, I have to stop and think to actually say it in Hebrew. But if I say it in Yiddish, it just trips off the tongue because I learned it when I was so young. Crazy, isn't it? Anyway, so Tishbi, Yitaretz, Kushiot, the Tishbi, i.e. Eliyahu Hanavi, will give us the solution, Yitaretz, will give us the answers, Kushiot, to the difficulties, and the last word you'll know, the Ba'ayot. You know what ba'aya is in modern Hebrew? Problem, that's right. You'll say, ein ba'aya, no problem. Okay, so this word teku stands for, it doesn't really, but that's what we were told, stands for Tishbi, Yitaretz, Kushiot, V'ba'ayot. The Tishbi will come along, Eliyahu Navi will come along and give us answers to these questions. Now, what's he talking about there? What does that mean? Eliyahu will come and give us the answer. Well, there is a, I don't know what you would call it, an idea, a concept that before the coming of Mashiach on his white donkey, Eliyahu Hanavi will return to earth and will proclaim the coming of Mashiach. And he will be the one that comes and proclaims the coming of Mashiach. And when he does so, when he comes down to earth from Shamayim, because Eliyahu Hanavi was one of those people who did not ever die, he was taken up to Shamayim alive, whatever that means, and he will come back to earth and he will proclaim the Mashiach. And when he comes to do that proclamation, all the tekus in the Gemarah, he will give us the answers to. That is what that teku means. Tishbi, Yitaretz, Kushiot, V'bayot. I don't know how many tekus there are in the Gemarah. David, do you know how many tekus there are in the Gemarah? I bet we could find that out with a Google search. But anyway, there's a lot of them, these tekus, a lot of draws in the Gemarah where we don't know the answer. And when Eliyahu Hanavi arrives to proclaim the coming of Mashiach, then he will give us the answer to all of these things.
Can I ask you a question, please?
Yes, Julia.
Is it purely coincidence then that Hatkufa has 3 of the same letters as Teku? Because it's got a Taf, a Kuf, and a Vav, which
seems... it is, because Kufa comes from the verb lahakif, to go around, to surround, as in hakafot that we do on Simchat Torah when we go round around the bima. So yeah, it's a different route. The pay there is an important part of the route. Right. Okay. Yeah. So actually, the truth is we don't really know where teku comes from. Those 3 explanations that Steinsaltz gives us, that it comes from tikom, to stand up, or tik, a pouch, or teku, tishbi, yitaretz, kushiot, v'bayot. We don't really know what the word means. We don't really know the real source of the word. Pechter's law, of course, the more explanations there are, the less likely they are to be correct. We've got at least 3 explanations to this word now, so who knows what it really means, but its meaning, who knows where it comes from, I mean, but its meaning is we don't know the answer. I think we do know the answer, and I think that what it really means is that the Kufa, the season's reason, is the main reason. And I think, and Rashi actually says so too, And I think the reason for that is because we have a scriptural proof. It says it very clearly that Chodesh HaAviv, the month of spring, must be when Pesach is. So that's interesting. That word teku, I think that's the first time we've come across teku in Sanhedrin. I don't remember having it up till now. David, you're going to tell us how many tekus there are in the Gemara?
No, you have to ask Eliyahu Hanavi the answer to that. I'm sure, if someone wants to Google it, they'll find out. But again, to support you and Rashi, let's just look at the historical context, because of course after the Churban Bayit Sheni, only the season's argument is relevant, because after the Churban, people didn't go to Yerushalayim. Not only did they not go to Yerushalayim, they weren't allowed to go to Yerushalayim. There was nothing to go to Yerushalayim for. So therefore, the status of their produce at the time had no bearing. What's interesting is, dependent on which Rabban Gamliel we were talking about in the past few weeks, who lived after the Churban, or if it was the younger Rabban Gamliel, which was before the Churban, let's assume it was the later one, were they keeping up the intercalation of the year, even though it was only academic? Were they doing it out of hope that the Beit HaMikdash would be built speedily, and therefore they would be the intercalation would be relevant in the timing of the first fruits and the Omer, so that they'd be able to return back to be Oleh Regel.
That's really interesting. I'd like to pick up on both of those points. That's really interesting. The first point, which you said, was that actually only the Tekufa was relevant because we couldn't bring the Omer and we couldn't bring Bikurim. That's true. I'd never thought of that. That is true. But they still had the concept of Chodosh, of the new produce, because even we have that today. As I explained to you, there are people who are very careful. It's only Drabonon now, of course, not Deoraita, but there are people who are very careful not to eat anything from the new produce until after the time when the Omer would have been done had we had a Beit HaMikdash. So I'm sure you're right, David, that Kufa was much more relevant, and probably that's why Rashi and me and everybody else who you would ask would say it's the seasons issue. I'm sure that's right, although we just need to just mention that this Chadosh thing is still D'Rabbanan, even though it's not D'Oraita. The second point you made is a really, really important sociological point, and that is that these Rabbanim who were in the time period, which by the way is called a Tekufa, just to confuse you, the time period straight after the Churban Bayit Sheni, they of course had to work very hard to maintain that hope that you spoke about there, David. They had to work very hard to keep the people from being despondent, from feeling completely hopeless and thinking they would never go back. Remember, they had, none of them would remember it, of course, but they had history that the first galut between not the first galut, because the first galut, I suppose, was Mitzrayim, Egypt, but the galut after the destruction of the first temple, the Babylonian diaspora, only lasted 70 years. So once you've got beyond 70 years, people are starting to think, oh, it's never going to happen, Mr. Pessimistic. It's never gonna happen. We're always going to be in exile. Well, it took till 1948, didn't it, till we came back and so they weren't wrong. But those rabbis in that time period worked very, very hard, and we've spoken about this when we talked about Shavuot and Matan Torah, that they wanted to maintain the people's love of the Chagim. Now, Pesach was a bit easier. Even though we couldn't do the Korban Pesach, we still had matzah, we still had maror. It wasn't the same. We didn't have the Korban Pesach, but at least we had something. Sukkot, it wasn't the same. We didn't have the Simchat Beit HaShoeva. We didn't have the great happiness and the joy that went on in the Bet HaMikdash, but we did have the Arba Minim, the 4 species. We did have our Sukkot that we could sit in. Shavuot, of course, had nothing. So they tagged on the most important thing, which happened to be more or less around that time, which was the giving of the Torah at Har Sinai. And of course, that then became the main focus of Shavuot, because the real main focus of Shavuot, which was the Bikurim, and it was an Atzeret, an end festival of Pesach, had gone out the window because it didn't exist. So these Chachamim were indeed that. They were Chachamim. They were very, very wise and clever people. And you can see, if you look at this, you can see the development of Judaism and the development of customs, the development of the halacha, the development of the strong minhagim. You can see their thought processes. And what David just mentioned is really a very, very good example of that. That they wanted to make sure that the people didn't lose hope. And so they continued to do the intercalation of the year based on the fact that, next year we may well have the Omer offering again, because Mashiach is going to come and we're going to have the Bet HaMikdash is going to be rebuilt. And so therefore we need to make sure that we don't forget what we're doing. And that has continued right the way through the millennia. There is a custom, by the way, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but with the exception of Art Scroll, who do have one, you will find that if you look in a Jewish bookshop and you go and buy a Sefer Kinot, the book which we say the dirges on Tisha B'Av from, all the Kinot that we say on Tisha B'Av and Megillat Eicha from. There's a special book where we say all these from. You will find that if you go into the bookshops, you will not find very many hard copies. They're all softbacks. And do you know why they're softbacks? David knows why they're softbacks because I saw him nodding just now. Anybody else know why they're all softbacks and there aren't any hardback Kinot books? Go on, David, tell us.
Sorry,
what did you say, Johnny?
Because you might be crying on them and making them soft. You make the hardback soft.
No, that's not the reason.
Is it so you don't use leather to bind them?
No, it's not because you don't use leather to bind them. David will tell you.
Because they're temporary, hopefully, so they shouldn't last long.
We're expecting before next Tisha B'Av to tear them up, right? Because
I heard of a minhag in pre-war Europe that they would burn the Kinot books every year after Tisha B'Av.
Right, that's an extension of that minhag. That's probably a little bit excessive.
Yes.
But it's the same idea. So no, Art Scroll came along and they do make a hardback Kinot book now, but you will find many places.
The ones we used to use in England, the black ones, were hardback as well.
Yeah, but they don't count. Minhag Anglia, it's not from.
And also the new Koren Kinot is hardback.
So if you go into the Hasidic places, for example, the Hasidische Stieblach, you'll not find any hardback Kinot. The reason being that we are so confident and so hoping that the Bet HaMikdash will be rebuilt before next Tisha B'Av, that when it is, we want to be able to rip them up, and it's a lot easier to rip them up if they are softback than if they are hardback. And I can confirm that, having seen my wife rip up Chaim Walder's books last week, which you might well have seen on Facebook. she posted a video of herself ripping up Chaim Walder's books. Well, they were hardback, so they were a little bit more difficult. Anyway, that is why the keynote. How did we get onto that? Yes, we got onto that because David said that, and I'm sure that's right, that they continued these intercalations because of the grain and the fruit, even though they no longer had the ability to bring those korbanot, those sacrifices, to the Bet Mikdash. It's a very important point. Okay, so let's move on. We've done Teku now, and we will carry on. Now, we said earlier on that one of the reasons for intercalating a year was if the grain is not yet ripe. Well, we've got to ask the question, where are we talking about? Because the climate in Eretz Israel, even though Eretz Israel is only a tiny little place, the climate is very different in the north to the south. You know, you go up to the north, it's quite chilly parts of the year. You go down to the south in the Negev, it's boiling hot. So the question arises about, because the grains may well be ripe in one part of the land and not the land. So the Gemara is asking us a question, and it's a very sensible question. It's where are you talking about? Which is the part of the land which determines whether we say the grain is ripe or not? And Rav Steinsaltz has given us. Oh, hang on a minute. Okay. This Rav Steinsaltz has given us this lovely map here, this lovely coloured map, which shows us that the land was basically split into 3 regions. And it's very interesting which 3 regions. You've got Judea, which of course includes the Jerusalem area, which is the temple. You've got the Galil over here. You've got the Kinneret here, and Tveria, of course, which is a very important town when we come to Mishnah and Gemara, because there was a time when the rabbis were up in that area. And you've got the Upper Galil and the Lower Galil. And the third area, and this is a bit that fascinates me, is actually Transjordan. It's actually the other side of the River Jordan, which we, post-1948, don't consider to be part of our land. Or at least the world doesn't consider it part of our land anyway. It was, of course, part of our land because Moshe Rabbeinu conquered it from Sichon and Og. And who was it that lived over this area in Transjordan? You'll remember our famous tribal map. It was Reuven, Gad, and half of Manasseh. So the 3 areas that it seems were the most populous, the most important, were Judea, Galilee, and Transjordan. And that's what the Gemara is now going to ask our question. So Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Al Shlosha Aratzot Ma'abrin et Hashana. There are 3, Aratzot is the plural of Eretz, okay? Eretz. 3 lands, doesn't mean 3 countries, it means 3 areas of the land. 3 areas of the land which we consider when we are intercalating the year. So as Rav Steinsaltz says, meaning that the court considers the agricultural situation in 3 regions. Yehuda, that's Judea. Aver Hayardain. Aver means the other side. That's the root, by the way, of the word Hebrew. Ivri is the root, is Aver. Why was Avraham Avraham Avinu, Abram, was the first one to be called an Ivri, a Hebrew. And why was he called a Hebrew? One of the explanations that why he was called a Hebrew is that he came from Aver HaNahar. He came from the other side of the river. It wasn't the river Jordan they were talking about there, actually. It was the river Euphrates. But he came from Aver HaNahar. He was from the opposite side, from the other side. Another explanation as to why Avraham Avinu was called an Ivri is because all the world was on one side, practicing polytheism, and he was Aver, he was an Ivri, he was a Dafkanik. He was on the other side against everybody else, and he was the first, or at least the first, to re-recognize monotheism at that time. So that word Aver Hayardain, Aver means on the other side. That is an interesting piece of etymology. That is the word Hebrew. Ivrit, of course, is the same root. Ivri is the same root as Aver, meaning the other side. So the other side.
Menachai mean, Johnny? Is that not the same word? Aver Menachai.
No, that's Aver. It means a limb.
I know what it means, but how is it spelled?
It's with an aleph.
Ah, okay.
So the other side of the Jordan and the Galil, of course, is up there by the Kinneret. So the same idea we spoke about before. We said of the three reasons, we have to have two in order to intercalate. We then went on and said, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel said, no, Tkufat on its own is okay. But initially, the Gemarah said, we need two of them. And this Breita here has the same style. And it says, Al shtayim mehen ma'abrin, va'al achat mehen ein ma'abrin. So, in other words, when we are talking about the unripe grain, if two of the three regions have unripe grain, that is a reason to intercalate. But if two of them have ripe grain and one of them has unripe grain, then we don't intercalate. In other words, it goes by the majority. But you will see that it, as everything with the Gemarah, it's not quite so straightforward, because the Gemarah, the Breita sticks to the same style as our previous Breita, which was that we said, remember, when it's the reason is because of the grain being unripe, everyone's happy because they don't want to wait if the grain's already ripe. They use the same expression here. Ubizman sheYehuda achat mehen hakol smechin. Everybody's happy if one of the regions which has got unripe grain, one of the two that you need to intercalate, is Yehuda. They like, in other words, again, it's really the opposite that we're interested in. If Yehuda has got ripe grain, and the other two regions have got unripe grain, and they intercalate because of those other two reasons, people are not happy. Why are people not happy? Well, you actually have to know a bit of background there, because there is a halacha that says that it's best to take the barley when it is fresh and moist and full, when you take the barley offering. And we find that in the Torah, in Vayikra. Let me just see where it is. I've got it on the screen somewhere. Here we go. It's in Parshat Emor. Let me share the screen with you. Okay, Leon's not with us today, so I'll have to do the reading. Okay, we're talking about the waving of the Omer. Remember, this is the day after Pesach. or if you're a Sadducee, it's the day after Shabbat Chol HaMoed, Pesach. And he shall wave the Omer before the Lord, so that it will be acceptable to you. And the Kohen shall wave it on the day after the rest day. That's what we talked about last week. Okay, and then you have the lamb, blah, blah, blah. And have a look over here. Verse 14. V'lechem v'kali v'charmel lo tochlu. You shall not eat bread or flour or made from parched grain, that's kali. Caramel, fresh grain. That's what caramel means. Fresh grain. Ad etzem hayom hazeh, until that day. Okay, so the barley is referred to here as caramel, and it's a contraction of two words. Caramel. Take the first two letters of caramel, and you have a kaf and a resh. Yeah. Switch them around. So the resh comes first. Resh, chaf. What does that read? Yes, Julia, correct. Rach. And what does rach mean? We had this a couple of weeks ago. What does rach mean?
Only?
Oh, that's rak with a kuf.
Oh, okay. Rach.
David?
Tender.
Tender. Remember, we had it. I asked you about if anybody could read my mind. Eventually, David read my mind with the eyes of Leah. The eyes of Leah were called rakot.
Rakot.
Tender eyes. Rak means tender. So caramel, the kuf and the resh, is used to spell the word rach, and mem lamed, and stick an aleph on the end of it. What are you left with?
Melach.
Full. Correct, Julia. Full. I'm reading your lips. Julia said full. Malay, full. So caramel means fresh, full, tender barley. And from here, from that word, the rabbis deduce that the barley that should be used for the first Omer offering should be tender and full and fresh. Now, where was the Omer offering offered? In Yerushalayim, Michael, correct. In Yerushalayim. And in what region is Yerushalayim? Yehuda. Okay. So if the grain is not ripe in Yehuda and they have to bring it from the Transjordan, or they have to bring it from the Galil, let's go back to our map. If they have to bring it from all the way up here or all the way over there, what's going to happen to it on the way? Right? It's going to go off. It's going to get dried out. It's going to be a bit manky. It's not going to be tender and fresh and full. So the rabbis learned from this word kalmel that the barley offering should be, if possible, brought from the region of Yehuda, close to Jerusalem, so that it should be nice and fresh. So now we understand what it means when they say they were happy. Where are we? Here we go. Because if Judah's barley is not yet ripe, then they're going to have to bring ripe barley from elsewhere, and it's going to be a bit not good for the Omer offering. Whereas if they then intercalate and they wait until Judah's barley is nice and ripe, then it's going to be the best possible Omer, and we want to do the mitzvah in the best possible way. And so everybody is then happy that we intercalated, and that's what it means. There is also, of course, the same idea, because if the crop in Yehuda is ripe, and they're going to intercalate from the other regions, we've still got the same problem, haven't we? We can't use that ripe barley to make our bread with, because we're not allowed to use it until after the Omer, which is now a month later. And during that month, again, the barley is not going to be as fresh as it should be. So Hakol Smechin, everyone's happy when the reason for the intercalation is that the barley in Yehuda is not yet ripe. And then it says, She'ein Omer ba Ella. Remember, Ein Ella, that's one of the very, very first things we did back in November 2019. Ein Ella means only. She'ein Omer ba Ella Yehuda. The Omer should only really come from the region of Yehuda. And that's the idea of that particular Breita. And it's interesting because it tells us really of the three main populations of Eretz Yisrael at that time. Okay, so whilst we're talking about the intercalation, so far we have spoken about why we intercalate. We intercalate for those three reasons: unripe barley, unripe fruits, and the season being out of kilter. We also learnt that when we're talking about the barley, we look at three different regions of Eretz Yisrael. So I think we've got it, the reasons for which we intercalate. The Gemara is now going to talk about how that intercalation was done, and specifically, to start with at least, where the intercalation was done. Where the intercalation was done. So, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis learnt, Ein ma'abrin et hashanim, ela biYehuda. We only intercalate the years when the Bet Din, the Sanhedrin, is located in Yehuda, in Judah. Now, what's the relevance of that? And it goes back a bit to what David was saying earlier on about the time period that we were talking about. Up until the end of the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, the Sanhedrin sat in Yerushalayim. Oh, that's obvious, right? The destruction came along in 70 CE, and they were exiled from Jerusalem. Jerusalem was destroyed. Where did the Sanhedrin go to from there? From Yerushalayim, where did it go? Think Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai.
Yavne.
Yavne somewhere.
Yeah, Yavne, correct, Julia. Ten li Yavne v'chachameha. Give me Yavne and its wise men. So they all decanted off to Yavne. And where did they go from there? They went up north. They went to Tveria, around there, Tzipori, all those places. If you've never visited those Mishnaic sites in the north, around Tveria, Tzipori, very, very worthwhile a visit. Tremendous amount of Jewish history up there in the north there, in the Galil. That is where very much of the Mishnah was put together. So the Sanhedrin was not in Yerushalayim at that time. So the question that's asked here is a bit like what David was saying. How can you intercalate? What's the point of intercalating it all with all those other things? And there's an implication here that you could only intercalate when the Sanhedrin was located in Judea. And there's a little H there, which means we have to go to the bottom of the page and have a look at what it says. The court may intercalate the years only when located in the region of Judea. If the court intercalated the year when located in the region of the Galilee, the decision is nevertheless binding after the fact. That's what we're going to say next. So, ein ma'abrim et hashanim ela b'Yehuda. You only, there's another ein ela, you only can intercalate the year if you are sitting in Yehuda. However, im ibruha, that's a past tense. If they did intercalate it b'Galil, mu'uberet, it stands as an intercalated year. So in other words, b'diavad, after the fact, it counts. But there is a dissenting opinion to that. There's a chap here called Hanania who lived in a place called Ono, and he said the following: He'id. See that word He'id there? See the root of that is aid, testify, witness. That's right. So he testified. This Hanania, Ish Ono, Hanania, who was a man from Ono, he testified as follows: Im ibruha bagalil eina mu'uberet. He says no. If they did make an intercalation in the Galil, it doesn't count. It doesn't work. It's not intercalated. And Rabbi Yehuda tries to explain this. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Breda Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yehuda, the son of Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi, says, "My tama dechananya ish ono." What is the reasoning that Hanania said that it doesn't count if you don't do it in Yerushalayim, in Yehuda? And he brings a pasuk in the Torah. Amakra, he says, the pasuk says, L'shichno tidrishu uvata shama. Now, there's a pasuk that says those words. Now, if you were learning Dafayomi, right, you would have about 15 seconds to actually know where those words came from and what it meant and what was the context. But since we don't do Dafayomi, we can actually go to the Psukim and see exactly what this pasuk is talking about. So we go to Devarim chapter 12, verse 5, and I will get it up on the screen for you now. There we go. It is in Parashat Ra'eh. There we go. So what are we talking about? We're talking in Parashat Ra'eh. These are the statutes and ordinances you shall keep to perform in the land which Hashem is going to give you. And then it's talking about when the Bnei Yisrael were to enter the land, they were to have nothing to do with the local populace's gods and temples and all that stuff. Verse 2, you shall utterly destroy from all the places where the nations that you shall possess worship their gods, on the lofty mountains and on the hills and under every tree. So that's what they did. They went to the top of the hills and they had their monoliths, and that's where they worshipped the god Baal and all the other gods. And then they had their special trees, the Asherah trees and what have you. And we're told we have to destroy them. You shall tear down their altars, smash their monuments, burn their Asherim trees with fire, cut down the graven images of their gods and destroy their name from that place. Doesn't leave much to the imagination, does it? We've really got to do that. And then, so we've got rid of all of the Avodah Zorahs in Eretz Israel. And then the Torah says, and this is our pasuk, verse 5, but only to the place which the Lord your God shall choose from all your tribes to set his name there, you shall inquire after his dwelling and come there. So this pasuk here, we're not told it's Yerushalayim, but we're told that the place which God will choose in due course, which turned out to be Yerushalayim, you shall inquire after his dwelling and come there. That's the pasuk that our Gemarah quotes. So just looking at the Gemarah, you wouldn't have a clue what it was talking about. What it's talking about, the first is talking about where you shall do your offerings. Look, and there you shall bring your burnt offerings and your sacrifices and your tithes, and there you shall eat before the Lord, blah, 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 blah. What does it say about intercalating a month? Nothing. So what is our Gemarah talking about? Our Gemarah brings a pasuk from the Torah that's got nothing to do with the subject that we're talking about. Let's go back to the Gemarah, and we'll just we're almost out of time, so we'll just finish here. Let's go back to the Gemarah. There we are. Hang on. Right. So this Hananiah Ish Ono says, no. We can only intercalate a year if we're sat in Yerushalayim, because the verse says you have to l'shichno tidrashu uvata shama. The verse says you shall seek his abode, and there you shall come. And it's talking about sacrifices. I've just shown you that. So the Gemarah tells us what he's talking about. They use, pardon the pun, they use a drasha on the word drasha. Okay? Can you see the word drasha in our pasuk? L'shichno tidrashu. See the word drasha in there? Dalad reish shin, yeah? So he says, kol drisha sha'ata doresh. Any drisha, any explanation, any we know what a drasha is. It's a expounding of the Torah. Any kind of drasha sha'ata doresh, that you expound. Lo yiyeh ela b'shichno shel makom. It's a play on words. He uses this word tidrashu, even though our pasuk is talking about sacrifices, and he's not talking at all about intercalating years. He uses it, and he makes a whole drasha out of the word drasha to show that any kind of expounding of the Torah, which includes intercalating the year, can only be done in the area of Yerushalayim, in the area of Yehuda. And that was the Gemarah's explanation of why Hananiah said what he said. And it comes from that verse 12:5 in Parashat Re'eh, which has got absolutely nothing to do with our Gemarah. And that's the beauty of it, because by looking at that verse and understanding where it came from, you then understand the next part of the Gemarah, which is, why do you need to be told this? Kol drisha ata doresh, because it doesn't make sense. The verse that he's quoted has nothing to do with our subject. So he makes it to do with our subject by doing a drasha on the word drasha. And so I think that's a good place to start. To stop, I mean. We'll carry on next week, please God. A very, very interesting halakha next time, which has very important implications for our own prayers in this time in the 21st century as well, and we'll do that next week, starting from here, Tanu Rabbanan. So we did quite a lot today. Look at that! How much we did. We went all the way from Teku, and we did all of that. That's huge.
Can I ask you something?
Julia on Daf Yomi. Yes, Julia.
It's quite odd. This is quite an important subject, but it's all in Baraitas. None of it is in the Mishnah.
That's interesting. Never thought of that. Yeah. Well, just shows you how important Brighter's are, I guess.
You're a doctor, not a lawyer, Johnny.
Sorry?
You're a doctor, not a solicitor.
Correct. That's why I don't think of these things. That's a very good point, that.
Very good.
You would have expected it to be in the Mishnah, wouldn't you? Because it's so important. And yet it ended up on the cutting room floor as a Brighter. Interesting. I'll think about that, and I'll ask somebody who knows more than me and see if they've got an answer. David, have you got an answer to that?
But Baraita's, as you say, halachic rulings that are out that were ended up on the cutting floor, exactly that. And here's a particular example from Hanania of Honor, giving a ruling which doesn't appear to be the normative halacha. There's a very interesting Tosfos on the page here that discusses a parallel Gemarah in Brachos, which is the opinion of Rabbi Akiva that you can pass that you can do Ibur Hashana anywhere, and he also quotes Yerushalmi that suggests that the Nevi'im, Yirmiyahu and Yechezkel, did Ibur Hashana when they were in Galut in Bavel. And the pasuk that what's his name, Hanania of Ono, the Shichnot Tidrashu Vatashama, Rabbi Akiva's got another pasuk, Ki Mitzion Tei Torah, to show that that it can be done anywhere in Eretz Yisrael, anywhere where there is a Torah study taking place.
That's interesting. I should have mentioned that the halacha is not like Hanania ben Ono. They did do Ibur Shana when they weren't in Yerushalayim, so I should have mentioned that. But to go back to, we can understand, therefore, why Hanania Ish Ono, why his ruling ended up on the cutting room floor. But what about the Braita of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Alat Kufa? That one's a bit more difficult to understand how that ended up on the cutting room floor, because of course that's
so what would actually happen in the Bet Midrash is that you'd have these rabbis discussing, and there would be a rabbi there who would be called the Maturgamam, which it wasn't the translator. He would be the guy that would read out Braitot, statements from other rabbis, either of the same generation or the previous generation, and they would discuss these statements. And if we're dealing with statements of Tanaim, then this is obviously before Yehuda Hanassi compiled and finished the redaction of the Mishnah. So some of the statements got into the Mishnah, and of course not all the statements that are in the Mishnah are halacha. You still have disputes in the Mishnah itself, and it's only much later that the halacha is laid down. And then you've got these other discussions which never found their way into the Mishnah, but we have these opinions recorded in Braitot and also in the Tosefta, which were the halachic discussions which didn't even get into the Braitot.
Yeah, so I mean, that's absolutely, of course, all right, but it doesn't answer our question, because if this Rabban Shimon Gamliel, as you suggested, is the Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel before the compiling or the redaction of the Mishnah, I would have expected his opinion on the Tkufa to have been in the first division section, which is the Mishnah. So I think Julia's question's a good question on that bit, anyway, not on Hanania Ish Ono, because I mean, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi had to draw the line somewhere, didn't he? And
you're not going to get all the opinions of Premier League Rabbanim, of Premier League Tanaim appearing in the Mishnah. There are plenty of statements by Rabbi Akiva that don't find their way into the Mishnah, and
That's
you can't
right.
say that Rabbi Akiva was anything other than Premier League.
I think the question remains, and I think that question is just made stronger by what you've just said. Why isn't Rabbi Akiva in the Mishnah on his opinion? You know, even Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi is not always in the Mishnah. You've got Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, and he wrote the thing, or he redacted. It's an interesting question, Julia. I don't know the answer, except to say that perhaps to call the brighter second division is probably perhaps not quite as stark as I made it out. Interesting point. Any other comments or questions before we go?
It's championship, Barata, not second division.
No, you're right. I'm showing my age, Johnny. Okay, great. Shabbat shalom, everyone. Watch out for the messages we have. I'll just stop the recording now because we don't need to hear what I'm going to say now on the recording.